Last week we saw the call of Moses to be the leader that would finally fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham, that I'm going to bring your descendants to this land to live. But first, they're going to spend 400 years in a land that's not theirs and be servants or slaves. And we focus mostly on the excuses that Moses made. But finally, thankfully, he listened and he would go to Egypt according to God's arrangement and demand that Pharaoh let them go. This morning, we'll look at a few things, take a few minutes to look at the events that led the Hebrews out of Egypt. But then we're going to spend the remainder of our time looking at Pharaoh's part in all of this, namely his hardening of his heart. This is what we read in chapter 4, verse 21 of Exodus. Jehovah said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I've put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." That was the word that God gave Moses. It was a gracious thing that he did, because you can imagine how discouraging it would be for Moses to go finally and do that, and for Pharaoh to say, "No, not going to do it." So God's warning him ahead of time. But the thing that he said in particular has led to some confusion and misgivings, maybe I should say, about what exactly is going on here. Why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? And so that he wouldn't let the people go, if what he wanted him to do was let the people go. And we'll see that in just a few minutes. Apparently, in a general sense at least, we learned that the people of the Hebrews were fairly comfortable for a long period of time of their sojourn in Egypt. They weren't a free people, but they also, it wasn't awful. Their burdens weren't that horrendous. They were well fed. They had some leisure time to themselves and for personal interests and other things like that. But they would have never wanted to leave Egypt if it stayed that way. And what ended up happening, as we saw last week, in a sort of a summary sense, there came a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph and who increased the burdens of the people of Israel, the Hebrews. Well, to make matters even worse, when Moses goes to ask Pharaoh a very simple request, very humble request, very reasonable, we just want a 3-day journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to our God, Jehovah. Pharaoh said no, and actually increased their labor even more. So their burdens got worse and worse and worse. We won't get into the details of exactly how he did that. But it was not a great start for Moses and for Aaron. Remember, Aaron's right there with Moses this whole time. Aaron's actually the one talking to Pharaoh, not Moses. Although we normally say Moses did it. Moses went in and told Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Actually, Aaron's the one who was doing that on behalf of Moses. Very interestingly, Aaron is called Moses' prophet. God told Moses, "Your brother Aaron will be your prophet." Very good definition of what a prophet is. Moses was going to be God's prophet. Aaron was going to be Moses' prophet. In other words, Aaron was going to speak the message that Moses gave to him. That's what made him a prophet, Moses' prophet. Moses was God's prophet, but then because of Moses' excuses, they had to have this middleman arrangement that wasn't God's intention anyway. But Aaron is speaking to Pharaoh. The people start blaming Moses and Aaron. But finally, it was going to begin to unfold. And God says, "I'm going to bring some wonders, some events upon Egypt that will declare my glory that will ultimately lead Pharaoh to let you go, so I can bring you to this land that I've promised to give you. So Moses and Aaron go to Egypt. They go back to Pharaoh, and they make this request. And Pharaoh's refusal was going to have horrendous consequences. Pharaoh refused. And these consequences, we know of them as the plagues. 10 plagues. Some of them are difficult to know exactly what they are because there's some crossover in some of the words, like especially the third and fourth plagues. But according to some, here's what God brought on Egypt, starting in chapter 7. The first plague was going to be turning the Nile into blood. You can imagine that the Nile River is probably the most important thing in anywhere in the country of Africa, or the continent of Africa, where it goes through. Because we'll see a map here in a few minutes at the end. It's all like desertous. But then you'll see this green strip that goes down, and that's all the area around the Nile. Because the Nile is such a fundamental source of life for the people in Egypt and wherever the Nile runs. Well, now it's been turned into blood. Can't eat the fish. Can't drink the water. Can't use it. This was to get Pharaoh to wise up. By the way, as we look at these plagues very briefly, each one has been said to be against one of the Egyptians' gods. Each one. The real target of these plagues was the gods of Egypt. This one was against the sacred river god called Nilus. Their sacred river god. Well, Pharaoh hardened his heart. Didn't work. Each time there was a pattern. He cries out to Moses to cry out to Jehovah to make the plague stop, and he'll let them go. He makes it stop, and then Pharaoh says, never mind. Nile's back to normal. I take it back. Fingers were crossed. Whatever. So then the second plague comes along. Frogs. And you might think, frogs, how bad can that be? Look at them. Look how cute they are. If that's what you call cute, I don't know. But you have to understand how many there were. Everywhere. I like hearing the frogs. After it rains, sometimes you can hear them. Sometimes you'll see one. Toads, anyway. Apparently they're different than frogs. Frogs everywhere. In their bowls, in their pots, getting in their houses. Finally, make them go away, and I'll let you go. Moses cries out to God. He makes the frogs go away. The ancient goddess of reproduction, Hecht, was represented by a frog. This was a plague. This was a direct slap to that goddess, it would seem. Frogs go away. Pharaoh says, never mind. Again, change his mind. Not going to let you go. Enter plague number 3. This is where the language can differ a little bit. It seems gnats is what is most likely intended here. Gnats. You ever seen a big swarm of gnats walking down a trail or something, and they're always just right there together in a bunch. Imagine that all over the place. If it's even meant to be gnats, the kind of gnats that we think of as gnats. Some of the versions say something different there. In fact, several versions might say flies here, or even flies on the next one, as we'll see, or maybe interchangeable, or one or the other. Whatever it was miserable. And it made everything miserable. I want to make one point that also causes some confusion sometimes. We read that one of the things that Pharaoh, his go-to move was to call his sorcerers. And what these sorcerers were, these enchanters, as the old King James says, that Wayne read a second ago, they were magicians. Now, to our minds, a sorcerer and a magician are very different things. A magician is somebody that, in the movies at least, people hire for birthday parties and stuff, you know. I've never been to a birthday party that had a magician, but I've seen it in the movies. I've seen a magician. I know what a magician is. But a sorcerer sounds like something very much different. It's not. They're not. They're not really that different. It's the same word. The word from which we get sorcery comes from the same root, where we get the word magic. So when we read, for instance, that the sorcerers or enchanters or magicians of Pharaoh were able to do what Aaron did, there's a key phrase. It says, by their secret arts. Arts. They did it by some sort of secret art. They weren't actually doing it, in other words. They did something that seemed to be the same thing. They were practicing some sort of secret art. Aaron wasn't practicing an art. Aaron wasn't really doing anything except what God said, and God made it happen. They were just mimicking with their trickery. That's what a magician does. It's an art. It's really an art. There's no real science or anything to it. It's an art. That's what these sorcerers and enchanters were doing. They weren't actually doing exactly what Moses and Aaron were doing. They were doing something seeming to be that, enough to satisfy Pharaoh, and I guess maybe some of the people, although that would change soon. Well, Pharaoh pulled the same stunt again. This one is said to have been against the god of earth, Seb being his name. So plague number 4 comes in, flies. And these have been said to be what are called dog flies, which are apparently very large and are able to even kill animals. And they latch on to things. One of their favorite things to latch on to are eyelids. Sounds great, doesn't it? And they were everywhere. I don't like any kind of fly. Horsefly, housefly. But whatever kind of flies these were, no thanks. Everywhere. Against the sacred scarab. Kaphira is the best you're going to get from me. This led to Pharaoh's first attempt at compromise. He wanted to compromise. He's starting to cave a little bit. He's starting to be overcome. He says, okay, you can go and sacrifice, but it's got to be a place I appointed. It's got to be within the land. You can't go far. Moses says, no. It's got to be a 3-day journey. Finally, he makes the flies go away. Pharaoh changes his mind. Enter plague number 5. The death of livestock, but not all livestock, the Egyptian livestock. Against the sacred bull or cow, Apis or Hathor, all the Egyptians' livestock die. The livestock of the Hebrews over in Goshen, totally fine. Not one of them dropped. But the ones of the Egyptians did. Because God said, I will show that I make a distinction. And he's going to make that distinction again later on. As it goes on, the same thing happens. Pharaoh changes his mind, takes it back, will not let the people go. Which led to the next one. Number 6, boils. You may notice this is not a picture of boils. let me take this moment to offer you a piece of advice, okay? Don't search for pictures of boils. Just don't do it. You'll thank me. If you ever accidentally do it, you'll thank me later. Maybe you're one of those weirdos that likes boils. I don't know. I'm not. So I didn't want to show it, and I didn't want to see it, so I just got a generic picture of Egypt. Just imagine boils on whatever you want to think of as a boil. Against Typhon, the evil eye god, apparently, some sort of connection there. All the Egyptians and the people there were overcome with boils. Same thing happened, though. Please take them away, make them go away. Moses prayed, Aaron prayed, I guess I should say, at least in his presence, or maybe Moses did after the fact. Goes away. Well, now that the boils are gone, no big deal. Nah, I've changed my mind again. So hail comes next. A hailstorm against the god of the atmosphere, Shu. And this hail was probably quite something. Enough to kill. There's a very interesting statement made here, though. That whoever feared the word of Jehovah hurried his slaves and livestock into the houses when this warning came. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of Jehovah left his slaves and his livestock in the field. You see that distinction and that clarification? Who was it that suffered from this plague? The people who didn't pay attention to the word of God. They did not pay attention, simple as that, to the word of Jehovah. It's no different today. There are those who fear the word of Jehovah in context, who listen to it, and there are those who don't pay attention to it. And those who don't pay attention to the word of Jehovah, there will be consequences. After the hail went away and Pharaoh again took it back and changed his mind, the 8th plague came. Locusts, which are different than cicadas, by the way. Very, very different. If all locusts did was make an annoying racket that is constant all day, wouldn't be that big a deal. These creatures are pretty apocalyptic. They eat everything, vegetation-wise. And one swarm has been said to contain as many as millions of locusts. And they come through, and when they come through, they will eat whole fields. I forget the exact number of the amount that one swarm can consume in a day. I think it's like in the tens of thousands of acres or something like that. But don't quote me on that. It is unreal. And we can only imagine how much multiplied that would be when God's causing this. So what the hail left behind, the locusts ate it all up. Egypt's in a bad place right now. All because of their leader and his stubbornness. They're suffering. He just won't let those people go. Doesn't want to. This caused Pharaoh to try to compromise a second time. Okay, you can go, but you got to leave the women and children behind. If they leave the women and children behind, you know what they'll have to do? They'll have to come back. Moses says, no, we're all going. He makes the locusts go away. Pharaoh says, never mind. Which led to the 9th plague, darkness. Now, there's interesting descriptions of this darkness that have led scholars to conclude that this was not some sort of miraculous, prolonged solar eclipse, but a sandstorm, a dust storm that goes through and consumes all light. But you think about in an eclipse, you get a torch, you can get some things done. What's a torch going to do for you in the middle of a big, huge dust storm, sandstorm that just won't go away? Nothing. You'll just, oh, now I can see the dust. Now I can see the sand. You still can't see anything. We get the idea that it was something other than just darkness. It was this kind of storm causing darkness. And that's why it says the people of Egypt didn't even leave their houses for 3 whole days. They just didn't leave. There was no point. This was against the sun god, Ra. The locust, by the way, was against the protector. They had a god that was the protector from locusts, named Serapis. He didn't do his job at all. This was against the sun god, Ra. And he said, okay, you can leave, but you have to leave your livestock and your herds. Same trick as before. If they leave the livestock, they're going to have to come back. Moses says, not only are we not leaving our livestock and our herds, you're going to give us more. You're going to give us some extra. And we will leave. And then, darkness goes away. Pharaoh says, forget it. That leads to a little break before the final plague. The 10th plague was threatened. It was the death of the firstborn in Egypt. And in the midst of this is the institution of the Passover. Very first Passover, as first instituted. And the Passover lamb, as we've seen in previous studies, is so profound with its typification of Jesus. Everything about the lamb of the Passover. So many things that we don't have time to get into. This was against the God of life, naturally. Pia. These were also directed against Pharaoh as well, because he was deified. They called him a god himself. So this Passover was instituted, and it was in remembrance, not remembrance, but as a reminder of being passed over in this 10th plague. He said, you take some of the blood of this lamb and you put it on your doorpost and on your lintel above your door, and whenever the destroyer comes through, when I see that blood, I'll pass over that house. So the death of the firstborn potentially was not only upon the Egyptians, but also some Hebrews, if they did not have the blood spread on their doors. Sadly, Pharaoh's heart was still hardened. He was still stubborn, and this came to pass. And God told the people, you are to eat this Passover with your shoes on, with your belt fastened, because you need to be ready to go. And that's exactly what happened. After this, Pharaoh, the people really laid into Pharaoh, started earlier, saying, why are you doing this to us? Just let them go. And finally, he did, but not without a chase. The people were giving the Hebrews things, basically probably just telling them, just please get out of here. Please leave. And that's what they did. But Pharaoh was going to pursue them. Been in Egypt for quite a while now, just very quickly. Goshen seems to have been somewhere up there in the northern part of Egypt. They go, they stop at Succoth, it says. Then they get to the Red Sea, which is the Gulf of Suez, which, by the way, back then, supposedly, apparently, ran all the way up to the Mediterranean, whereas this is a satellite image from today, and it's dried up there in the northern part. But where they crossed, obviously, was larger back then, but they're trapped. So God opens the Red Sea and allows them to go across on dry ground. When Pharaoh and his men come, closes up on them. God delivered them. And that led to Moses writing a song of deliverance and thanksgiving to God. It says, Moses and the people of Israel sang, I will sing to Jehovah, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Jehovah is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. Jehovah is a man of war. Jehovah is his name. Even though the Hebrews were saying this in a positive way, every single soul in Egypt knew this same thing in a not so positive way. They learned, as God said, they learned who Jehovah is. And if Pharaoh had not been so stubborn and hardened his heart, none of that would have ever happened. Which leads us to what I said earlier. What is all this about God hardening Pharaoh's heart? Why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? There's something very interesting we have to understand about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. There are 20 times, or about 20 times, I had some trouble finding all 20 of them, but I think I did. 20 times when Pharaoh's heart is said to have been hardened. 10 of those times, God is said to harden it. And the other 10, Pharaoh is said to harden, or the people of Egypt. At least in one occurrence it says the people of Egypt also, or his men, hardened their hearts. 10 times and 10 times. Sometimes God is said to do actively what he simply allows to happen. And even in a manner of speaking, if God said, I'm going to harden his heart, we use language like that sometimes, even today. If you say something like, I made them mad, I made him angry, or I'm going to make you mad. Well, you didn't really make anything, did you? Something that you did or said caused them to become angry. You didn't actually reach into their heart or mind and make them mad. It could be that that's the kind of language that is used here of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. And I am inclined to believe that based on the fact that 10 times also he is said to have hardened his own heart. In fact, maybe the most dramatic one is in chapter 9 when it says, in this he sinned again. He sinned again and hardened his heart. Pharaoh was in control of his heart. God did not take control of Pharaoh. Pharaoh did exactly what Pharaoh wanted to do every single time. And so that's why God told Pharaoh at one point, the only reason you're Pharaoh at all is because I made you Pharaoh. And I made you Pharaoh for just this time in history, because I knew that you would do this. I made you Pharaoh. You are the perfect candidate to be Pharaoh for this moment of me letting my people go. And he proved that. He proved the truth of that. He unintentionally declared the glory of the one true God by his stubbornness. So no, God did not arbitrarily take over Pharaoh's free will and make him do something wrong. God doesn't do that. But what God was doing was causing Pharaoh to be more and more stubborn, more and more hard-hearted. We might make the same mistake today. Notice this statement in Exodus 10:3, where God said, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? That's what Pharaoh was doing. He was refusing to humble himself before God by being stubborn. Earlier in Exodus at the beginning when it says the Pharaoh rose up who didn't know Joseph, it may have been probably was a different Pharaoh, maybe than the one that Moses dealt with. But that Pharaoh was worried about the people rising up against them. They're going to outgrow us. Well, this Pharaoh, that Pharaoh may have been like, we just need to get them out of here so they don't, cause any trouble. Well, that's all God wanted to do. Get them out of there. But he didn't want to do that. He was exalting himself. He was stubborn. He was self-willed. He was hardened. His heart was hardened against the will and word of God. He was refusing to humble himself. But it was always whenever he thought things had gotten better. When things were looking bad, Pharaoh declared, even got to the point where he just said, I've sinned against you. And I know that your God is the real deal. That's a very big paraphrase. But then when everything calmed down, when he saw there was a respite, a little space for some breathing, he took it back. Sometimes we do that. Things are getting really bad. Maybe we've got a terminal illness or a severe illness of some kind, and we think, we start thinking about our life and I'm going to start doing this, I'm going to start doing that. If I just survive this, if I get through this, and then you get better, and then our mind, it's like a light switch. It's like, I got carried away. I don't know what got into me. And you don't do any of that stuff. Because you had a respite. Things are good now. Things are okay. Things have gotten better. So I'll just go back to what I was doing before. That's what Pharaoh was doing. Every time it was when things seemed to be okay. It's going to be okay after all. Nah, not going to listen. Don't want to do what God has said. Need to remember what the Hebrews writer said, Hebrews 10:31. It is a fearful thing. Here's a lesson from the Exodus account. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. God is loving, yes. God is merciful, yes. God is gracious, yes. God sent His Son because He loves the world so much. He sent His Son and gave His only begotten Son to give His own life for the sins of the world, yes. But it's still a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God in consequence to our own stubbornness. We can learn from Pharaoh, believe it or not. Pharaoh was allowed to be deluded. God let him believe a delusion. The same delusion that we all might fall for in a basic sense. I don't need God, and I don't need to listen to God. I've got my own things, I've got my own gods, I've got my own will. I don't need that God. I don't need that will. God will let us believe that same lie, that same delusion. How do we prevent ourselves from falling for it? How can I know that I'm not going to fall for the same delusion that Pharaoh and that so many others have? Love the truth. That's what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. They did not have a love for the truth, and so God allowed them to believe a lie. They believed a lie because they did not have the love of the truth in them. So God will help us and strengthen us against those delusions if we love the truth, if we believe the truth, if we receive the truth by obeying the gospel and remain firm to the truth by holding on to it. How will God strengthen you? Your heart. Maybe that's another way of translating that. God strengthened his heart. Well, in the context of Pharaoh, it was strengthened against God because of his own sin and evil. But he can strengthen our hearts in the other way. Strengthen it against evil. What about our hearts? Is our heart hardened against the will of God, or is it hardened against our own things, hardened against the things of the world? We know what the answer should be. But is it? If you need to respond to the invitation, now's always the best time. God offers that invitation 24/7, anytime that you choose to make things right, to start a new life, to start following Him. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, that's where you start. If you haven't been baptized into Christ, repenting of your sins and confessing Him, that's the starting point. If you have done that and you've walked away from the path, getting back on the path is where you start. that first step back onto the straight and narrow way.